Sunglasses first, then a fistful of hairpins, then the sunscreen she kept for a beach she'd never once lain on. Jack watched it all bounce off the mossy deck boards without raising his voice, because packing up someone you no longer wanted only ever took as long as it took. Rotting shack for a loser. Chloe had called the place 10 minutes earlier, and he'd said nothing back, only run one thumb along the spine of the old leather logbook on the windowsill, the same battered book that would, 8 months on, end her lawsuit before she ever saw it coming. She stood in the middle of the bach now with her arms crossed, sunglasses pushed up into hair that had cost more than the power bill, glaring at the exposed rafters as if they'd personally offended her. "Sell it," she said again. "Sell the land, sell this pile of driftwood, and put the money into something that actually matters. Into me. Into the spa. Ponsonby rent isn't going to pay itself, and I am not spending one more summer smelling like seaweed and fish guts." Jack set down the mug of instant coffee he'd been holding. The good plunger coffee could wait. He wasn't going to waste it on this, and walked past her into the bedroom. He pulled her suitcase down from the top of the wardrobe, unzipped it on the bed, and worked through the drawers with the same rhythm he used bedding fish, quick, unsentimental, done. Her creams. Her serums. The imported hair oil that cost more than a week of diesel for the boat. He didn't fold anything. He didn't need to. "What are you doing?" Her voice climbed an octave. He didn't look up. "Packing you a bag." "You can't be serious." "Jack. Jack." He zipped the suitcase, carried it out through the ranch slider, and set it down on the deck, the same deck his grandfather had laid by hand, the timber silvered and soft now with 60 years of salt and moss creeping up between the boards. Chloe followed him out, still talking, still louder, but he had already stopped hearing the words as anything more than wind. He set the case down gently, almost politely, and stepped back inside. "You'll regret this," she said through the fly screen. "You have no idea what you just started." He closed the door. Not slammed, closed, with the quiet finality of a man locking up a boat shed for the night. Then he went back to the kitchen, picked his coffee up again, and drank it while she was still out there, still talking to a door. He was 48 years old, and this was the first genuinely peaceful moment he'd had in longer than he could remember. To understand why Jack Sinclair could stand in his own kitchen with that kind of stillness while a woman shouted herself hoarse on his deck, you had to understand what the bach actually was to him. It sat on a headland above Tairua, a squat, weathered building of macrocarpa boards and a low tin roof that had gone the color of a stormy sky. Jack's grandfather had built it in the 50s with driftwood and stubbornness, and Jack's father had added the second bedroom in the 70s, and Jack himself had replaced half the piles 2 summers ago, working alone on his knees in the mud at low tide because he didn't trust anyone else to get it right. His hands showed it, broad, calloused things, permanently faint with the smell of linseed oil from the timber he oiled every autumn without fail. He wore a swandry even in December, because the wind off the strait didn't care what season it was, and because his father had worn one, and his father before him. 3 generations of Sinclairs had learned to swim off that headland. 3 generations had gutted snapper on the same bench by the back door, had watched the same nor'easter roll in over Slipper Island, had fallen asleep to the same particular hush of waves that Jack still couldn't properly describe to anyone who hadn't grown up with it. The bach wasn't a holiday home. It was the only fixed point in a family that otherwise didn't have much to hold on to. Chloe Ashworth had never understood a single part of that, and to be fair to her, she had never tried to. She was 42, sharp-edged and immaculate, the kind of woman who could walk into a room in Auckland and have 3 people offering her a drink before she'd taken her coat off. She hated the smell of the sea, hated it specifically, the way some people hate the smell of hospitals. Salt got into her hair and ruined it. Sand got into everything and she resented all of it, quietly at first and then not quietly at all. She'd met Jack 4 years ago at a fundraiser he'd been dragged to by a mate, and what she'd smelled on him that night wasn't linseed oil or salt air. It was land value. A headland section on the Coromandel Peninsula, unencumbered, 3 generations deep, worth a small fortune to the right developer. She had never once, in 4 years, called the bach anything other than your father's shed until she wanted something from it, and then, suddenly, it became our home. For weeks after Jack put her suitcase on the deck, a courier van came up the gravel drive and left a thick envelope wedged in the letterbox. It was from a law firm in Auckland, the kind with a name made of 3 surnames and an address in the viaduct. Jack read it standing at the kitchen bench, the kettle ticking as it cooled behind him. Chloe was suing him. Not for anything petty, she was invoking New Zealand's de facto relationship law, claiming she and Jack had lived together continuously for more than 3 years, and that under the Property, Relationships, Act she was entitled to half of everything they'd shared. Half the land. Half the bach. Half of the one thing in Jack's life that had never, not once, belonged to anyone but his family. It was, on paper, a devastating letter. A weapon built to strip a man of both his fortune and his history in one clean legal motion, and dressed up in language cold enough that it barely sounded like it was about people at all. Jack read it twice. Then he folded it back along its creases, set it on the bench, and filled the plunger with coffee the way he always did on a Sunday morning, measuring the grounds by eye, pouring the water slow so it bloomed properly. He carried the mug to the window seat, where his grandfather's old logbook sat exactly where it always sat, its leather cover cracked and soft from decades of salt-damp hands. He ran one finger along the spine without opening it. And he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was thin and quiet, and it didn't reach anywhere near his eyes, the smile of a man who has just been shown a hand he already knows he can beat. Outside, the tide was coming in over the mud flats, the way it always did, on schedule, indifferent to lawyers and Ponsonby rent and every claim a person could put in writing. Jack looked at the logbook a moment longer, then looked back out at the water. He didn't call a lawyer that afternoon. He didn't call anyone at all. He simply sat with his coffee, the letter folded on the bench behind him, and let the silence of the box settle back around him like something that had never really left. The first post appeared on Instagram 9 days later. Jack didn't see it himself, his mate Dave forwarded it to him with no message, just a screenshot and 3 question marks. Chloe, sitting on a driftwood bench somewhere that was absolutely not the Coromandel, captioned a soft focus photo of the ocean, gave up everything for a love that turned out to be a lie. 3 years of my life in a cold little house by the sea, and this is how it ends. Sending strength to every woman who's ever been thrown away by a man who couldn't handle being loved. 211 comments. Heart emojis. Strangers telling her she deserved better. Jack read it once on Dave's phone, standing in the car park outside the New World in Wangamatta with a bag of groceries in one hand, and felt something twist low in his chest that had nothing to do with anger. It was closer to grief. He had loved her, once, or he'd loved the version of her he'd let himself believe in, the one who'd sat on that same driftwood bench their first summer and said the sound of the tide was the only thing that had ever made her feel small in a good way. He didn't know if that woman had ever existed, or if he'd just wanted her to badly enough to invent her. You right? Dave asked. Yeah. Jack handed the phone back. Yeah, I'm right. He wasn't. 2 days after that, his phone rang with a number he half recognized. Sarah, Chloe's oldest friend, the one who'd stood up at her sister's wedding and made a speech about loyalty that had made half the room cry. Jack. Hi. Sorry to just ring like this. It's fine, Sarah. What's up? I just, a breath, careful, rehearsed. I saw what's happening. With the case. And look, it's none of my business, but Chloe's a mess, Jack. She cries every time I see her. She gave up her whole social life to move up there with you, and now she's got nothing. No house, no partner, and everyone in Ponsonby looking at her like she's a joke. Is there really no way you two could just sort something out? Before it gets ugly? It's already ugly, Sarah. I know. I always thought you were one of the good ones. That's all. I hope you know what you're doing. She hung up before he could answer, which was probably for the best, because he didn't have an answer that wouldn't have sounded either cruel or pathetic out loud. He stood on the deck for a long time afterwards, looking at the spot where the suitcase had sat, and did the thing he almost never let himself do. He wondered if he was wrong. If somewhere in the story Chloe was telling, there was a version of the truth he'd missed because he hadn't wanted to see it. Then he went inside and oiled the window frames, because his hands needed something to do that wasn't thinking. The letters from Chloe's lawyers came weekly after that, each one a notch tighter than the last. The fourth one landed on a Tuesday, and Jack drove it straight to his own solicitor's office in Thames rather than read it alone at the kitchen bench. Graham Petrie was 61, wore the same 3 ties in rotation, and had done Jack's father's conveyancing 30 years earlier. He read the letter twice, took his glasses off, and rubbed the bridge of his nose. They're pushing for family court now. Formally. If you don't sign the settlement offer by the 15th, they're filing. He slid the letter across the desk. They want a public hearing, Jack. That's not subtle. They want you dragged through it, your name, the property, all of it, in front of a judge and whoever wanders into the public gallery. It's pressure, plain and simple. Let them file. Jack. Graham leaned forward, elbows on the desk. I need you to actually hear me on this one. De facto relationship claims in this country are decided on the balance of probabilities. Balance. Not proof beyond doubt. If Chloe stands up in that courtroom and says with a straight face that you two lived together for 3 years, and she'll cry doing it, she's very good, a judge might believe her. People believe confident, tearful women. It happens more than it should. You could lose the land. You could lose the bach. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I understand exactly what you're telling me. Then for God's sake, take the settlement. Offer her a lump sum, keep it out of court, keep the headline risk off you, and move on with your life. It'll hurt, but it won't gut you. This, he tapped the letter, this could gut you. Jack looked at the letter for a long moment. Somewhere behind his ribs the same old ache flared up, the one that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with a woman on a driftwood bench who might never have existed at all, and the 3 generations of Sinclairs who'd trusted him to keep the one thing that was actually theirs. No, he said. Jack, I said no, Graham. His voice didn't rise, but something underneath it went very still and very hard. I'm not signing anything. Not a settlement, not an apology, nothing. Tell them to file whatever they want. Graham sat back, exhaled through his nose, and studied him the way you'd study a man about to step off a curb into traffic. All right. It's your call. But I want it on record that I advised against this. Noted. The mediation happened in a glass-walled conference room on the 4th floor of an office block in Hamilton, the kind of room where the air conditioning hummed just loud enough to make every silence feel deliberate. Chloe arrived 12 minutes late in a cream coat, her eyes already glassy, a folder clutched to her chest like a shield. Thank you for coming, she said to the room in general, not looking at Jack. I know this is hard for everyone. Her lawyer, a sharp young woman named Priya Nair, opened with photographs. She slid them one at a time across the polished table, Chloe on the deck of the bach in a sundress, laughing, an arm slung loosely around Jack's shoulders, Chloe on the same driftwood bench, wine glass raised at sunset, Chloe barefoot in the shallows, hair wet, grinning at whoever held the camera. These were taken over a period of years, Priya said. My client has photographic and testimonial evidence of a genuine, committed domestic partnership. She's not asking for anything she isn't entitled to under the Act. Frankly, given what she's given up, she's being generous and only seeking half. Chloe finally looked at Jack directly. Her chin trembled. I don't want to fight you, Jack. I never wanted this. If you agree to the settlement, I'll drop everything else. No court. No more posts. I'll disappear from your life completely, I promise. I just need something to start over with. Please. The word please landed somewhere soft in him, and he hated that it did. For one unguarded second he saw her the way he used to, not the woman who'd called his family's home a rotting shack, but the one who'd fallen asleep against his shoulder on that same deck their second summer together, saying she never wanted to leave. He didn't know anymore which of those women was real, or if either of them had ever been. He said nothing. He kept his hands flat on the table, and he looked at the photographs one at a time, slowly, without expression, while something in his chest twisted tighter and tighter. Graham cleared his throat beside him. My client has heard the offer. Will respond in writing. Chloe's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough. That's it? That's all you've got to say to me, after everything? Jack finally spoke, quiet and even. I heard you, Chloe. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting today. Her jaw tightened. The tears dried up faster than Jack expected, replaced by something flintier underneath. Fine, she said, gathering her folder. We'll let the court decide, then. And Jack, when this is over, don't come crying to me about what it cost you. She left first, heels sharp against the tile. Priya followed, offering Jack a look that was almost sympathetic, the kind lawyers give a man they expect to lose. Graham waited until the door clicked shut before he spoke. That went about as well as I feared. Jack didn't answer straight away. He was thinking about the logbook sitting on the windowsill at home, about the neat, boring, relentless columns of dates and weather and a woman's comings and goings that he had never once shown anyone. He thought about how close Chloe had just come to crying real tears over a lie so total she'd apparently convinced herself of it. She's going to say it on the record, Jack said finally. At the formal interview. She's going to swear to it. Graham frowned. Probably. Why does that matter to you specifically? Jack picked up his coat, and for the first time since the letter had arrived in his letterbox, something like calm returned to his face, not the calm of a man giving up, but the calm of a man who has simply been waiting, patiently, for someone to walk far enough out onto thin ice. It matters, he said, because once she says it under oath, she won't be able to take it back. He didn't explain further, and Graham, watching him gather his things with that same unreadable stillness from 4 weeks ago, decided, not for the first time, that there was a great deal about Jack Sinclair he still didn't understand. The formal interview took place 3 weeks later, in a smaller room on the same floor, with a court reporter's laptop clicking quietly in the corner. Chloe sat very straight, hands folded, coached and composed, and answered Priya Nair's questions in the calm, practiced voice of a woman certain she had already won. And can you confirm, for the record, the nature of your living arrangements from early 2022 to the present? Yes. Chloe's chin lifted slightly. I've lived full-time at the property in Coromandel since March of that year. It's been my sole residence, my only home, the entire time. I gave up my flat in the city to be there. I endured a great deal, honestly, for that relationship. The isolation, the cold, the mold in winter. But I did it because I loved him, and because it was our home. Thank you. Nothing further. Jack sat with his hands loosely folded on the table, and said nothing at all, and when the reporter looked up expectantly, waiting for cross-examination, Graham simply said, "We have no questions at this time," which made Priya's eyes narrow, just slightly, the first crack in her certainty. The real hearing came 6 weeks after that, and it was Jack who asked to speak first. He set the leather logbook on the table in front of him, its cover soft and dark with age, and beside it a slim folder that hadn't existed the last time Chloe had seen him in a room like this. This, he said, laying a hand flat on the logbook, isn't a diary. It's a working record. My grandfather started it to track tides, wind direction, catch counts, things that matter if you make your living off the water. My father kept it going. I kept it going too, out of habit as much as anything, and somewhere along the way I started noting who was actually at the bach, and when, because in a house with only 2 proper bedrooms, it matters who's sleeping where and for how long. He opened it to a marked page and turned it so the judge could see the neat, unremarkable columns, dates in one margin, weather in another, a scattering of short notes in his own handwriting. Chloe up Friday p.m., gone son, said Mozzie's too bad. C arrived late sat, left before lunch mon, complained of the cold. C not up this WKND, Auckland thing. According to Ms. Ashworth's sworn statement, Jack continued, she lived at the property full-time, continuously, from March 2022 onward. My own records, kept for entirely unrelated reasons over that same period, show a total of no more than 11 weekends a year. Never longer than 2 nights at a stretch. Never once through winter. Priya was on her feet. Your Honor, a personal notebook kept by the respondent himself proves nothing beyond his own account, which is why, Jack said, before the judge could rule, I didn't rely on it alone. He nodded to Graham, who slid the second folder across the table. 8 months ago, on my solicitor's advice, I engaged a private investigator. Not to follow Ms. Ashworth around, simply to verify residence. Address history. Utility accounts. Card transaction patterns tied to location, which her own bank was able to confirm under subpoena. The folder told a story that needed no embellishment. A 1-bedroom apartment in Ponsonby, leased continuously in Chloe's name since January 2022, power and internet accounts active and paid without interruption. Credit card statements showing near-daily purchases at cafes, boutiques, and a beauty clinic within 4 blocks of that address, hundreds of transactions, spread evenly across every month of the year, including the depths of winter when, by her own sworn testimony, she'd been enduring the mold at Coromandel. Her actual, verifiable presence at the bach, cross-referenced against phone location data her own lawyer had unwisely allowed to be subpoenaed, came to just under 19% of the period she'd claimed to have lived there full-time. She was there for weekends, Jack said quietly, into the silence that had fallen over the room. Good ones, mostly. Photo weekends. She was never there for the life of it. Priya Nair had gone very still beside her client. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its polish. Your Honor, I'd like to request a brief recess to confer with my client. The judge granted it. Chloe didn't move. She stared at the folder on the table as though it might rearrange itself if she looked at it long enough, her face draining of the composed, tearful certainty she'd walked in with. When Priya leaned down and murmured something to her, Chloe's hand came up to cover her mouth, and whatever color remained in her face went with it. 10 minutes later, Priya stood and addressed the bench in a voice gone flat and formal. Your Honor, in light of new evidence, we are withdrawing the claim in its entirety, and I would ask leave to also withdraw as counsel of record. It was over inside of an hour. Jack didn't smile. He didn't glance at Chloe, didn't offer a word of triumph, didn't so much as let his shoulders drop with the relief he felt somewhere deep and quiet in his chest. He simply closed the logbook, gathered the folder, and stood, the way a man stands up from a job finally, unremarkably finished. Chloe caught him in the corridor outside, her mascara smudged, her voice raw. You could have just told me. 4 months ago. You could have just shown me that stupid book and I would have, you would have found another way, Jack said, his voice worn flat with tiredness rather than temper. This was never really about the bach, Chloe. You'd have found something else to want, and someone else's name to put it under. She didn't have an answer for that. He hadn't really expected her to. He walked past her, out through the glass doors and down into the ordinary gray light of a Hamilton afternoon, and didn't look back. He got back to Coromandel a little after 6. The tide was on its way in, the light gone soft and gold over the water the way it only did in early autumn, and the house smelled of nothing but salt and cut grass and the faint, familiar mustiness of old timber. No perfume. No hairspray. No sharp voice complaining about the mosquitoes. He put the kettle on, more out of ritual than thirst, and while it heated he carried the logbook back to its place on the windowsill, running his thumb once along the worn leather spine before he set it down. He found the old fountain pen in the drawer where it always lived, uncapped it, and opened the book to the next blank line. Outside, the wind had swung around to the southwest, the way it did most evenings this time of year, and the water on the mudflats had that first silver edge that meant the big tide was coming in properly tonight, the kind his grandfather used to say you could set a clock by. He stood at the window a moment, coffee cooling on the sill beside the book, watching the light change over Slipper Island, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could easily count, something close to simple. Then he sat down, dipped the pen, and in the same quiet hand his father and his grandfather had used before him, wrote the day's entry, wind southwest, tide big and rising, nothing else worth noting, one calm, ordinary line that closed the book on everything that had happened, and left no trace of her at all. I still smell the linseed oil sometimes before I see the tin, the way you learn a house through your hands before you learn it through your eyes. I've oiled those boards every autumn since I was a boy standing on a stool to reach the top rail, and I did it again this year, alone, the rag going black in my hand the same way it always has, and nothing about the afternoon marked itself out as the one after the lawsuit ended. I checked, twice, out of habit more than doubt, the 11 weekends were still 11 weekends, the folder was still in the drawer where Graham had filed it, and the board still needed the same 3 coats they'd needed every year of my life. I think about the folder sometimes, the one with the Ponsonby lease and the card statements, and I don't feel triumph when I do. I feel something closer to the quiet after a big southerly finally blows itself out, not relief exactly, just the absence of a weight I'd stopped noticing I was carrying. Chloe accused me once, in that corridor, of letting her walk into it. Maybe I did. I've turned that over more nights than I'd admit to anyone but this page. But I never wrote a false word in that logbook. I only ever wrote down what actually happened, on the weekend she actually came, in the weather that was actually blowing. It was never a trap. It was just true, and she was the one who decided to stand somewhere the truth could reach her. Some evenings I still catch myself listening for a second set of footsteps on the deck before I remember there won't be one, and I've stopped minding the sound of just my own. The mudflats fill in exactly the same whether or not anyone's watching from the window, which used to feel like the loneliest fact I knew and now feels like the steadiest one. I keep the book on the sill where it's always lived, spine soft, corners gone round with handling, and most nights now the entries are as plain as they were before any of this started: wind direction, the size of the tide, whether the snapper were running past the point. No mention of her. There doesn't need to be. The tide doesn't ask who's watching it come in, and neither, in the end, does the book. It just keeps its own quiet record, the way it always has, the way I mean to let it keep doing long after I'm the one who's gone and someone else's hand is the one holding the pen.